Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video, and today we're going to dive into some more extra history from the YouTube channel Extra Credits, which is fantastic. A lot of you have been around long enough to have seen me done my series going through the lead up to World War I and how that all got started, and I was really impressed by their attention to detail and the way that they presented the facts in such a way that made it really easy to understand and absorb, while also providing a lot of detailed information. So I thought I'd dive into another one today, and we're going to look at D-Day. And there's a reason why I've chosen this one. I'll be honest, the overwhelming majority of suggestions that I've had for the next extra history series to do has been the one about Bismarck. And I don't mean the ship, I mean the man. So we are going to get to that, but there's a reason I wanted to do D-Day today. I have an opportunity coming up on Memorial Day, which if you're not part of the U.S. and you're not familiar, the end of May is Memorial Day. That's our time where we remember those who have given their lives in the service of their country. And over Memorial Day weekend, at the end of May, I have an opportunity to be a part of a team of about 20 people that are going to be going to Toccoa, Georgia. If you are familiar with Band of Brothers, the fantastic series, my favorite series of all time, Toccoa is where they trained. And there was a mountain that they would run 3 miles up, 3 miles down. It was called Currahee, which also became the motto of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Well, Currahee, up on top of the mountain, has a ton of graffiti. I mean, like absurd amounts of graffiti. And so one of my favorite YouTubers, he does History Underground, which is, he actually does similar to what I've been doing with Fredericksburg, which is he visits historic sites and he talks about them. He presents them in a fantastic way. I love his stuff. Well, he organized a group of 20 people to go and clean up at Currahee. So I'm going to be a part of that team that's doing that, and I'm really excited about it. So I wanted to do D-Day just because I'm thinking a lot about the guys from Band of Brothers and the other units that trained at Currahee. I'm going to be making some videos while I'm there, show you guys around the base. I'm also going to be visiting Chattanooga, so we'll look at some of the Civil War battlefields around Chattanooga as well as the Battle of Chickamauga. It's all kind of in that same North Georgia area. So that's all going to be coming up. And as always, if you want to support this channel, there's a number of ways to do that. You can look at those links in the description. There's a fundraiser going on to help raise the funds for me to travel to Europe, where I can make some videos about D-Day, about World War I, about Waterloo. There's a lot of places I want to visit, so you can help with that. You can also join the team on Patreon if you want. And you can also check out my gaming channel, History Guy Gaming, which probably in the next 24 hours, we're going to be passing that channel and subscribers with this one. All right, that's a long enough introduction. Let's dive into D-Day. This is the first episode from Extra History.
When the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe and batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind.
That signal comes today. This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Months of effort have been building up to this day. Throughout England, 500,000 men have been gathered at staging areas to strike across the channel as soon as the signal is given. Men from the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, and Poland.
And let's not forget all of that, okay? A lot of people, when they think of D-Day, they think U.S., Britain, Canada, right? I mean, when we talk about the 5 beaches, we talk about Utah and Omaha Beach. Those were the American landing sites. We talk about Juneau and Gold Beaches, which were the, I think those were the British sites. So I think Juneau Gold and Sword were the British and Canadian sites, but none of that was simply just those nations. Look at all the nations that were involved in the landing at Normandy. We shouldn't forget that this was a very collaborative effort, and these were a lot of nations who had lost their territory to Nazi Germany and to the Italians, and they were going to be a part of getting it back. This was not just America and Britain and Canada coming in to free the world. These were people fighting to get their homes back. So that should not be forgotten.
Today, we'll be telling the American story, as best it can be told in a few short minutes, and over the coming weeks, thanks to the generous support of Wargaming, we will tell the story of 3 of the other major players involved. But that story begins with a dinner in Tehran in 1943. For the first time, the leaders of the most powerful Allied nations, the United States, the USSR, and the British Empire, met in one room. For years, Stalin, his nation battered by the Nazi invasion and bearing the brunt of the human cost of the war against Germany, had pressed the Allies to open up a second front to the war by...
And not an unreasonable request, right? I mean, Stalin is losing millions of men on the front with Germany. It is not too much for him to ask for us to open up a second front. Now, we were supporting him with supplies in major ways, but it's really only reasonable. For all of Stalin's faults, for all the terrible things we could say about the guy, it was not unreasonable for him to ask for the Allies to open a second front in the West. Let's back up a little bit.
Cost of the war against Germany had pressed the Allies to open up a second front to the war by invading France. The British had pushed back, arguing for operations in North Africa, and then an assault on Italy. But now, with the USSR winning on the Eastern Front, the demands from Stalin became harder to deny, and simultaneously, everyone started to think of the post-war settlement. If the Allies won without British and American troops liberating Western Europe, how could they stop the USSR from claiming huge swaths of land, and perhaps even, at least politically, dominating the continent?
And so this is a lot like, when a football player starts to turn to run for the touchdown before he's even caught the pass, and he ends up dropping it because of that. But this is the unfortunate reality. We haven't even started really decisively winning the war in Europe yet. Things are starting to turn after the Battle of Kursk. The Soviets started turning the tide and moving into Nazi territory. But the reality was that we had to think in these terms. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's kind of how the Soviets were. But we knew in a post-war world that they weren't going to be our friends. They were going to be fighting for dominance, and that ended up being true. So we had to start thinking in terms of how much influence could be brought to bear. And of course, that all played out after the war.
And so an agreement was made out in the deserts of Iran. The Western powers would open up a second front by invading France in May of 1944. Plans were drawn up. An amphibious operation of this size had never been tried. Men and material would have to be drawn back from around the world. New technologies would have to be invented. Engineering feats previously only discussed in conference rooms would have to be put to the test under wartime conditions.
This was not as simple as just sending a bunch of troops and getting them there. Think of the logistics involved with this. Think of the supplies that were going to be needed. Think of the food they would need. Think of the ammunition. Think of the ability to move things, the ability to even get them up to the beach. Think of all of the planning that had to go on and all the secrecy that was involved. We can't even begin to wrap our minds around all of the work, all of the man hours, all of the intelligence, all of the counterintelligence, all of the behind the scenes stuff that went on to make this happen. For the thousands of men who landed on the beaches or who dropped behind enemy lines that day, there were probably 10, 20, 30 or more men for each one of them, behind the scenes, men and women, who made that possible by the work that they did behind the scenes.
But the first decision that had to be made was where to land. There were 2 possible targets: Calais, the closest point in Europe to England, or Normandy, one of the farthest on the Channel coast. Calais was the sane, sensible place to land, but it had 2 notable disadvantages. First, terrain in which you could easily get bogged down, and second, the fact that it was the sane, sensible place to land. Reviewing the battle plan, Eisenhower and Montgomery were in agreement. They wanted the element of surprise, with the possibility of being able to rush off the beaches.
So Eisenhower was chosen to be the supreme Allied commander over all forces in Europe. Then beneath him, you had a bunch of basically sub-commanders, and the vast majority of them were British. So Bernard Montgomery was in charge of all land forces. You had another British guy who was in charge of the airborne forces, another one that was in charge of the air forces. And so you had all of these people that were making these decisions at the command level. But Bernard Montgomery was going to be in charge of the land forces, and so he definitely had a lot to say about where that was going to happen.
So the decision was made. Normandy it would be. But this would require one of the greatest counterintelligence operations ever attempted to keep the secrets safe, not to mention the equipment and the manpower on an even greater scale. Entire harbors had to be fabricated, which could be shipped over from England.
And this was one of the most brilliant parts of all this, these mulberry harbors that they produced. Because until they could capture some of the real harbors, like in Cherbourg, for example, until they could do that, they had to have a way of offloading supplies. They had to have a way to get things like gasoline across. They actually laid pipelines across the English Channel so that they could pump gasoline and oil across to supply the troops. Brilliant, just brilliant things that they came up with.
More landing craft needed time to roll off the factory lines, so the operation was delayed until June. Finally, the day arrives, June 4th, 1944. Planes prep, final drills are run through, tens of thousands of men board ships for the invasion, and then the rain starts to roll in. Soon it becomes a storm. Ferocious waves sweep the channel. Clouds completely block the sky. High winds buffet any craft that ventures on sea, land, and especially air. Eisenhower is forced to make the decision. The attack must be delayed.
And now the problem was they only had like one more night in which they could do this. If they had to delay again the next night, they were going to have to wait at least 2 weeks because you had issues on top of everything else, on top of all the stuff we've already talked about. You have to deal with the moon and how much light you have and how much light you want there to be. You have to deal with the tides and when they're at the right point. So they basically had to take all of these things into account. And imagine if you're a soldier. Imagine if you're one of these airborne guys that are all suited up with your, 50 or 100 pounds of stuff that you're taking in your musette bag, and you've got everything ready, and your mind is wrapped around what you've got to do. Or imagine you're one of these guys who's gotten onto the boats, and you're already loaded up for the channel crossing. You're mentally finally prepared for the fact that most of these guys have never been in combat before. Some had. And then they tell you to stand down for 24 hours. Oh my gosh, that just must have been agonizing for them.
Rain continues to pour the next day. A council of Allied commanders is called. If they delay again, they won't be able to launch until July. They need to do the channel crossing at night. They need to do commando raids and minesweeping when the unsuspecting Germans will have the fewest patrols out. But for a crossing of this magnitude, they need nearly full moon visibility.
Yep.
Even if they did decide to brave a launch without the full moon, tidal conditions wouldn't be right for another 2 weeks.
Yep.
What do? They've got thousands of men already holed up on boats, getting seasick and nervous and just plain stir-crazy. They've already started moving equipment and forces into staging areas which can clearly only be targeting one place, Normandy. And they've had to alert enough people up and down the chain as to the nature of the operation that with each passing day, the odds of keeping their landing location a secret plummet.
And there was actually an American major general, I forget his name, but he was drinking and he started bragging at a party about the D-Day operation, about Operation Overlord and attacking Normandy. And they actually sent him home and reduced him back to his peacetime rank, which was, I think, lieutenant colonel or something, or maybe a major. So he goes from 2-star general all the way down and gets kicked out. And he was actually a good friend of Eisenhower. So these are the kinds of things they're dealing with.
But to cross in this weather, that would be madness. Then a captain is ushered in.
Stag.
He's an RAF meteorologist, and he is about to make what may well be the most consequential weather report of all time.
No pressure, right? You're the guy who's... think of the flack we give to weather people, right? When they get it wrong. A couple of weeks ago here in Ohio, where I live, they told us we were going to get like a foot of snow, and we got 1 or 2 inches. And all of the weather people were on the news the next day saying, wow, we really screwed up. We got it wrong. We're so sorry. And they don't usually do that, but in this case, they really, really got it wrong. Imagine being this guy. He's a captain. He's a mid-level officer. He's not a general. He's not anybody like at the top of the chain of command. And he's the one who's got to give the forecast upon which this entire operation is going to be based. No pressure.
He says he believes it's going to be clear on the 6th. Eisenhower nods. The operation is a go. 6,000 ships begin to steam across the channel. Minesweepers fan out ahead of them, clearing a path. For weeks, the Allied forces have bombed the German Air Force in the region nearly to oblivion. No enemy interceptors exist to spot the waves of gliders and transport planes carrying 17,000 airborne troops. The ships won't reach the beaches until dawn, but the airborne infantry has night work to do. First in are the Pathfinders, the men whose job it is to light the drop zones for all the other parachute infantry. Of the 4 planes carrying these Pathfinders, one overshoots their target, another has to bail before ever getting to France, and the remaining 2 kept most of their signaling gear in the ditched plane.
So the Pathfinders, this is a fascinating thing, and I don't think they get enough credit for what they did. They would fly these bombers, right, or these transport planes, I don't remember which it was, and they would tow behind them these gliders. They were part of glider infantry, and the gliders were basically airplanes with no engines. And so they would release them and they would come in and they would basically do almost like a controlled crash landing on the ground. But because they had no engines and no lights, no electricity, anything, they were completely silent. And they would come in and they were the ones who had to put the signals, like he said, for the drop zones. And they were all over the place and got screwed up. But it was dangerous, dangerous work that they had to do. And there was also a lot of debate that happened with I want to say Lee Mallory was the name of the British general who was in charge of the airborne troops, and I think he died in the war later on. But Lee Mallory was pushing for the airborne troops to be dropped further behind enemy lines, where it would be a little safer for them, because he was worried about the casualties they would take. There were some estimates that were saying they could lose 70% of the airborne, but the ground forces needed them to be close enough to the front lines, to the beaches, to where they could affect the outcome. And they also had to secure these areas where, when they did get ashore on the beaches, where they could connect to the beaches. So it ended up that they chose the closer areas, and thankfully the airborne lost far fewer than they were expecting that they would.
Leaving them desperately trying to signal the paratroopers by waving flashlights at the passing airplanes. The paratrooper drop goes even worse.
Yeah.
Scattered by enemy anti-aircraft fire and blinded by low clouds, paratroopers jump from altitudes that are either too high, leaving them drifting slowly, unable to do anything but watch as enemy guns spit shrapnel up at them, or too low, breaking bones on landing as their parachutes don't have enough time to slow their fall. They're scattered all over, many of them landing miles from their drop zones, some landing in marshes or rivers, others being slaughtered as they drop right into the middle of the enemy. It was a harrowing and confusing night of chaotic firefights and desperate small unit actions. But the more veteran of the American airborne troops, groups like the Screaming Eagles and the 505th, managed to pull together to capture crucial road junctions, communication points, and bridges, and even destroyed some of the artillery batteries that would imperil the landing at Normandy.
And one of those was the one that's famously shown in Band of Brothers, where a dozen or so men from Easy Company of the 506th disabled the German, I think, 105s at Brecourt Manor. A brilliant maneuver where these 12 guys take on like 50 or more Germans and knock out this battery. And this is one of the reasons why the landing at Utah Beach was nearly flawless, and there were very few casualties compared to what was suffered at Omaha Beach, in part because of the success of that mission.
And they would hold fast, delaying or preventing any counterattack that might sweep the impending invasion back into the sea. Then there's the initial bombardment. Allied bombing runs go astray, causing massive damage to the civilian centers in Normandy, but doing little to weaken the dug-in German positions. As dawn breaks, though, the Allied gunners can finally see their targets, and the bombardment becomes far more effective, softening up the beach for the initial assault. But there's little time remaining until the troops' scheduled landing. At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the klaxons sound, and the assault craft are released. They plow through the chop, men huddled in their tin shells as German fire pours down, sinking entire landing crafts to the bottom of the sea just off the Normandy coast. Then the assault craft hit the beach, ramps drop, and men charge out.
And a lot of these assault craft because when they would open up, especially at Omaha Beach, when they would open up the front of these Higgins boats, the machine guns would just be zeroed in on them, and they would just kill almost everybody in them. So the guys started jumping over the sides. Well, the problem is they were weighed down with so much equipment that a lot of them drowned in the water before they ever got ashore. They also had these tanks that were designed, because it wasn't just infantry. They were sending tanks as well. And they had these tanks that were designed to basically float and float into shore, and a lot of them ended up sinking before they ever got ashore. A lot of this stuff, even though the technology was incredible, a lot of it did not go according to plan. But things also did, in some ways, went better than expected.
But on Utah Beach, things have already gone horribly. The men look around them and the terrain's all wrong. They've landed on the wrong beach. Luckily for the Americans, the oldest man in the invasion, and the only general to actually join these ground troops, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., happens to have landed with them.
And he had to push for this, because he's an assistant division commander. This is Teddy Roosevelt Jr., is the son of the former president, and he pushed and pushed and pushed to be allowed to land at Utah Beach. Ends up getting the Medal of Honor for his actions that day and organizing things when it was all chaotic on Utah Beach. Sadly, died of a heart attack, I think, a couple of days later, and he's buried over there. His brother was killed in World War I. He was a pilot and was shot down in the last few months of the war.
The local commanders ask him what they should do, and living up to his namesake, he simply responds, "We'll start the war from right here."
Yep.
He correctly assessed that the beach that they'd landed on was actually a better, more easily takeable landing point than the one that the senior staff had assigned them. In a miracle of heroism and logistical coordination, he managed to reroute the entire Utah Beach invasion force to his location, direct the battle, and continuously rally the men as he walked the beach with his cane, waving his pistol. His new Utah Beach would be the first beach successfully overrun, and for his actions there, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor.
Only 2 fathers and sons have been given the Medal of Honor in the U.S. military's history. He and his father actually got his after him. Years later, it was actually awarded, I think, by Bill Clinton to Teddy Roosevelt Sr. for his actions at San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. The other father and son are Arthur MacArthur and Douglas MacArthur. And Arthur MacArthur, his father, got his in the battles around Chattanooga. I think it was Missionary Ridge, but he was a colonel, one of the youngest colonels in the Union Army, and I think he was like 20 years old, and he led his regiment up the mountain and received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day.
Omaha, though, was a different story. Here, the pre-landing bombardment had been even less effective. The seas were choppy, landing craft took on water, and men tried to bail with their helmets. Some of the landing craft sank, and those that landed were filled with retching, seasick men. Much of the armored support that was supposed to follow them foundered in the waves, or simply got picked off as they hit the shore. Soon, the men were all pinned down against a small shingle of land that provided what little cover there was to be found on the beach. Many of the units had taken heavy casualties, and much of the command staff was dead. With units getting washed ashore in the wrong places, or scattered in the desperate scramble to try to get to the small ridge of sand that served as cover, the assault had become hopelessly disorganized. The second wave met with much the same fate. Hopelessly bogged down, withdrawal from Omaha Beach was considered, but it was the vital linking point between the British and American forces. As the day wore on, a number of Ranger units began to rally and scaled the bluffs, finally managing to assault German positions on the heights. At the same time, several of the naval ships came dangerously close to the beach to provide more effective support fire just as the German ammunition began to run out. Even after all of this, Omaha Beach wasn't truly cleared by the end of the 6th. But as the sun began to set on those bloodied beaches, it was clear that the American forces were there to stay. Join us next time as we join the British for their covert efforts to keep the biggest invasion in history a secret.
Good stuff. And like I said, as always, I highly recommend that you subscribe to Extra Credits. They have fantastic stuff, and every video of theirs I've watched so far has been really well done. You can tell they know their stuff, and they present it in such a way that allows you to really easily connect to it. So I'm very, very proud to continue to recommend them. I'll put the link in the description to the original video for this content. Make sure you give them a like and a subscribe. Check out the links in my description below, as I mentioned before. Thank you for watching, and we will be back with the next episode in a couple of days. Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. And as we dive into part 2 of Extra History's D-Day series, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who has been subscribing and commenting and liking the videos, joining us on Discord. It's just really been exciting. I started doing these reaction videos just a little over 2 months ago. And already we just hit 33,000 subscribers this morning, which officially moves this channel past my gaming channel, which I've had for the last 4 years. So as a way of saying thank you to that, we're opening up another giveaway. This time we're going to be giving away 3 copies, either on Audible or a hard copy through Amazon, of the biography of your choice. A biography about any person, living or dead, any historic figure of any kind. And we're going to give those away when we hit 50,000 subscribers. And at the current rate that we're at, that shouldn't take long. We've been averaging about 1,200 subscribers over the last week each day. So we could do that in less than 2 weeks, maybe even faster if you who are watching right now, who haven't already subscribed, do that right now. As soon as we hit 50,000 subscribers, we're going to close out that giveaway and we will draw 3 names. All you need to do is log in the link in the description below with your YouTube account, and that'll sign you up for the giveaway, and I'll randomly draw 3 names. Don't forget, as always, to like and subscribe. If you hit that little notification bell next to the subscribe button, you'll get a notification every time I post any new content to the channel of any kind, whether that's reaction videos, historic site videos, or whatever else I might decide to do. Let's dive into part 2 of D-Day. This time we're talking about the Secret War.
The south of England had become a vast military camp, jam-packed with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, all planning on a trip to the Normandy beaches in the early summer. The job of the British Security Service, MI5, was to make sure that on D-Day, the Germans were looking the other way. If they failed, tens of thousands of men would die.
So you remember, if you saw yesterday's video, we talked a lot about how even though this was an invasion of Normandy, there was so much more to this than just the invasion force. There was the deception part of this. There was the counterintelligence. There was the bombing campaign ahead of time. There was all of the planning and preparation. There was the weather forecasting that needed to be done. There was technology that needed to be invented that didn't even exist yet. And Operation Fortitude, which was the deception campaign, which worked brilliantly and was incredibly complex, is just one small part of that.
This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. In August 1942, desperate to score a success in the face of an unending string of military setbacks and defeats, the Allies carried out a daring raid on the French port of Dieppe. But the Germans were ready for them, fortified and prepared for the attack. It was an unmitigated disaster, leaving almost 4,000 Canadians dead on the beaches. This catastrophe convinced everybody that when the real invasion of France came, the Germans must not be prepared for it.
So, you know, often the best teachers in life are our mistakes. Hopefully we learn from other people's mistakes and not our own, but this was a perfect example of learning from your mistakes. They learned a lot about what not to do. We also had some beach landings in places like Africa, in Sicily, the invasion of Sicily in 1943, and all of these things, as well as what was happening in the Pacific with the island hopping, these things taught us a lot, especially about what not to do. So that gave us plenty of time to really prepare and get our ducks in a row for D-Day.
Or D-Day would mean destruction. This was, of course, going to be a little tricky. By 90 days after D-Day, the US Army alone planned to have 1.2 million men with all of their equipment in France. You can't just hide that under a bit of camouflage netting. And so was born Operation Fortitude, the most ambitious deception plan in military history. The operation wouldn't pretend that there was to be no invasion. That would be impossible. Instead, their goal would be to fool the Germans about how many were coming, when they would land, and where they would land. Army groups were positioned around Britain to confuse the Germans. The British Fourth Army was stationed in Scotland, supposedly preparing to attack Norway. General George Patton became the proud commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group stationed on the English coast opposite the Pas de Calais.
And so what we have is, I think it's called Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North, they were actually trying to trick the Germans into thinking that we were going to be launching an invasion of Norway from Scotland with the British armies there. And of course, a big part of counterintelligence and deception is understanding your enemy. And what we understood about the enemy was that as far as American commanders went, the Germans considered George Patton to be the biggest threat. They considered him to be our top general. And Patton never commanded an army group. He commanded an army several times. But an army group, which actually in this case was Omar Bradley, was the army group commander over Patton once they got into France. Army group commander has to deal with a lot more than just what's going on the ground at that given moment. So Patton was really best suited for commanding an army that he could lead in the field and not having to deal with the politics and the logistics and all of that kind of stuff.
The closest crossing to France. The British 4th and the US 1st were somewhat unusual armies in that there were no actual people in them. They were completely fake, made up, non-existent. The Allies had no real soldiers to spare. They were all needed in France for the actual invasion. So to get the Germans to fall for this massive bluff, the film industry was called in. They created a brilliant illusion, an entire dummy army. Wooden aircraft, inflatable tanks, 250 fake landing craft. 2 fake corps headquarters were invented, pouring out a constant stream of radio drivel.
I think I want to say Edinburgh Castle was the Fortitude North headquarters. And yeah, I mean, you shouldn't say there were no people in these armies, because they did have a ton of people to create all of the fake radio traffic. I mean, just think about the complexities of this deception. They were issuing orders over radio traffic, stuff they knew would be intercepted. They planted stuff on bodies that they allowed to wash ashore in mainland Europe that had some of the top secret plans for things. They were allowing all of this to happen. They had turned agents in England as double agents and had them sending back false reports that they knew the Germans would be able to then confirm with spy planes and things of that nature.
At one point, King George VI even made an official inspection visit, solemnly inspecting row after row of blow-up tanks and real troops who had been bussed in for the day, all while the daily newsreel broadcast this inspection to the world. George even managed to look thoroughly impressed. And, because you might as well go big or go home, this inflatable 1st U.S. Army was presented not just as a threat, but as the threat. The primary invasion force to be launched at the Pas de Calais. The Germans already considered this to be the most likely destination for the Allied attack. Now the Allies just needed to make sure that the Germans continued to believe that. And so was born MI5's 20 Committee, so called for the XX Roman numerals, Double Cross. Double Cross fed the Germans a constant stream of highly credible intel, a combination of utter rubbish and brilliant information delivered just too late to be useful.
So yeah, I mean, that's one of the keys too. It's gotta be believable. So you notice the key there. They gave them fake stuff that couldn't be disproved, but they also gave them real stuff, but real stuff that by the time it came into German hands, it couldn't really hurt us. So you've got to make it believable, and they sold this perfectly to the Germans.
Back in 1939, the British had turned a German agent into a double agent. He was pretty useless, but he had told MI5 everything they needed to know about how the German Secret Service communicated with their agents. The 20 Committee used this information to create an entire network of double agents. By D-Day, Germany's entire network of spies in Britain was owned by the 20 Committee. One agent was a Catalan codenamed Garbo. Garbo created a completely fictitious network of 27 agents who bombarded the German embassy in Madrid with messages, presenting an utterly convincing and utterly false picture. The real attack, they said, would come in the Pas de Calais. Any other perceived invasions, such as, Normandy, whatever, those were feints.
They went so far as to create an entire fake spy network. They even had the Germans convinced that they had spies they didn't really have. I mean, that is incredible. And, you know, I don't know enough about what the Germans had going on. I'm sure they had some very effective espionage going on as well, but I can't think of anything that's anywhere close to this level that they had working for them on the other side.
If you hear any guns or shouting over there, just relax, it's just the neighbors again, go back to bed. Garbo was good at his job. So good, in fact, that the Germans awarded him with the Iron Cross for his invaluable services.
And I should back up for a second, because something he said there was key. He talked about, you know, even if you see fighting and stuff happening, yeah, it's just a diversion. And that came in really important, because when the Normandy invasion started, when we dropped the paratroops behind enemy lines, when we started bombing them in the days leading up to it, Hitler intentionally held back the Panzer. They had these reserves that were kind of back behind the lines that could have been sent in as a counterattack to push them back off the beach. And I know part of it was that they didn't want to wake Hitler up in the morning when it happened and things like that. But so many of the German high command were convinced that even when the attack started, that it was a fake attack, that they wouldn't allow necessary reinforcements to go forward. And that probably goes back to this deception.
The danger, though, was that even if they fooled the Germans before the invasion, once the Allies landed, the deception would be over. All German military strength in France would be concentrated on Normandy, and the Allies would then, no doubt, be driven back into the sea. So, a series of new operations were concocted to convince the Germans that other invasions would follow the first all along the coast of France. Secrecy was critical. To help the invading forces, a complete photographic map of all of the beaches was needed. The RAF and USAAF ran hundreds of photographic missions, but they needed more. So the public were asked to send in all of their holiday beach photos. Then the toy maker Chad Valley was commissioned to take this intel and make a vast map of the operational area in jigsaw puzzle form for easy mobility. The jigsaw map was delivered by two men in two pieces. Neither of them knew which was the real one, and once the delivery was complete, neither was allowed to leave headquarters until D-Day was over.
Imagine having to be one of those, hey, at least we didn't kill them, right? I mean, that's what other cultures would have done in previous centuries, would be just to kill somebody to keep them from really revealing that information, but at least we let these guys live, right? So yeah, a big part of the intelligence that we needed for D-Day was even things like they needed to know whether or not the sand on the beaches at Normandy could support tanks, or whether the tanks would get stuck. You know, we had to know the consistency of the sand at the beaches. We had to know all kinds of things on the ground that you couldn't even get just from aerial photographs.
The British Armed Forces were obsessive about security. They arranged for 30 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force to dress in civilian clothes and visit pubs close to where the British commandos were staying. Their job? To flirt with the men and try to get them to spill some information about their mission. To everybody's amazement and delight, the commandos kept quiet.
Nice.
MI5 still worried that the news was out, though, and that the Germans would be ready and waiting. Back in 1942, the crossword in the Daily Telegraph newspaper had included a clue answered by the word Dieppe, just one day before the Dieppe raid had taken place. Worrisome. And now, on May 2nd, in the same crossword section came the clue, one of the U.S., and the answer was Utah, the code name for one of the beaches the Americans were to land on.
I never knew that.
Then, on the 22nd of May, came the answer Omaha, another beach. And then later, Mulberry and Overlord and Neptune, all code words for various D-Day operations.
Yeah.
Finally, MI5 descended in a fury upon Leonard Daw, the schoolmaster who wrote these crosswords. Turns out that it was all just an extraordinary series of coincidences. But the big question remained, had all of this deception and secrecy worked? And how would the Allies know if it had? They needed to be able to read German communications to be sure. The Germans used an extraordinarily complex encoding system, Enigma. The codes were changed daily, and there were 159 million possible permutations. German messages should have been impossible to read, but the British thought that they could crack the code. They assembled a team of brilliant mathematicians like Alan Turing at Bletchley Park to do it. Then the Allies had a lucky break. In May of 1941, a British ship forced a German U-boat to the surface. The Germans abandoned their sinking craft, but in the final moment, the British sailors managed to board and capture the most unimaginable treasure. a completely intact code machine and code books.
So this is the story that's told fictionally in the movie U-571, where they show it as an American crew. And this was I think the German naval Enigma machine, which was a little different. And of course, even the story that's told in the movie Imitation Game about Bletchley Park, leaves out a key part of this, which was that the most significant advances on breaking the Enigma code initially came from the Polish. The Polish had done this all the way back at the beginning of the war, and the British built on a lot of the work that the Poles had already done. So it wasn't as if they were starting from scratch, and it wasn't as if they did it completely on their own. The Polish had a big part to play in making this possible.
Soon, and for much of the rest of the war, the British were routinely reading German messages. One estimate has suggested that the intelligence gained from this find may have shortened the war by more than 2 years. It was through that intelligence that the Allies learned that the 20 Committee had been stunningly successful. When the balloon finally went up, every key German commander greeted the news of operations in Normandy as an invasion, but not the invasion. Critical German focus, men, and material remained on the Pas de Calais even after D-Day, confusing, slowing, and weakening the German response. It was little short of a miracle. And so D-Day began for the British and Canadian forces. The British beaches were called Gold and Sword, and the Canadian beach Juno. Churchill had insisted on proper names rather than silly code names, saying that no mother wanted to hear that her son had given his life at the Bunny Hug landings. The British parachute drop, despite massive confusion, achieved most objectives in the face of incredible odds. 700 men and a complete glider train of artillery were supposed to be sent to capture a critical German battery, but when all of the equipment and most of the men were lost in the landing, the 150 remaining soldiers, armed only with rifles and Sten guns, took the battery nonetheless. It's 7:25 a.m. at Sword Beach. Mine-clearing tanks thrash the sand. Sappers run beside them to disable mines and obstacles, frequently falling to enemy fire along the way. Then come tanks and flamethrowers throwing themselves at the German defenses on the dunes. And only then come the landing craft to release their cargoes of men. In the chaos, the schedule collapses in only half an hour. The beach has become a tangle of men, machinery, twisted wreckage, a chaos of dead, dying, and living. The air is filled with the roar of gunfire.
And this is important that they're covering this because, and I don't know if it's like this in the rest of the world, but at least as an American, pretty much when we talk about D-Day, we talk about Omaha Beach. And that was one of 5 beaches. Now, for the Americans, Omaha was by far the place of greatest death compared to Utah. But we forget there were 3 other beaches. There were 3 other really important pieces of this operation, and all 5 of them needed to be successful. And we've got to give due not only to the British and the Canadians, but to all of the other nationalities who were landing on these beaches.
Every moment is a drama of comedies, tragedies, and moments of heroism. But despite the cost, the landing at Sword was remarkably successful. By 9 p.m., many units were off the beaches and moving inland. At Juno, Canadian losses were heavier, but they soon broke through the coastal defenses, as did the British at Gold. The landing plan had worked amazingly well considering. Almost everywhere the German coastlines had been rolled up, and the Allies had complete control of the air. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Now was the time to strike hard and fast into the interior, to exploit the Germans' shock and seize the vital objectives, including the major town of Caen. There was a period of calm as men brewed up to recover from the initial assault, and then they moved inland to link up with the airborne units. Unfortunately, the beachheads behind them were a massive traffic jam. The roads were chaos, and their armor support was still fighting their way through that traffic to reach them. And the Germans continued to fight hard. Key strongpoints resisted and slowed the British and Canadian infantry's advance. At 6 p.m., a unit of the King's Shropshire Light Infantry came under heavy fire 3 miles short of Caen, and...
Oh, yes, that's the West Midlands, isn't it? Shropshire, I think that's right, not too far from Birmingham. It's over on the border with Wales. I have family from there in Shrewsbury. That's very cool.
Dug in for the night. With little armored support, pressing the attack and capturing the town was not an option. That night, men lay across a 60-mile stretch with their weapons, peering into a darkness lit by flares, tracer, and shells. D-Day had been a remarkable success, but as elite German divisions approached, the fight for Normandy was about to begin. And it would be harder than any could imagine.
Awesome, as always. So I know that there's a lot I don't know about the British and Canadian and others who landed at Gold Sword and Juno beaches. So if you've got something you can add to that, some insight, some cool story, some bit of information you think should be shared, we're all here to learn. And I hardly know everything. So I want to learn. So share your thoughts, share what you know about this, share what you would add, what you would maybe observe from what we just talked about. Use the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe and enter the giveaway in the link below if you want to be considered for one of those 3 biographies we're going to give away when we hit 50,000 subscribers. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. We are continuing going through these D-Day videos from Extra History, which are fantastic, really well done. And I just want to continue to say thank you for all of the great feedback that I'm receiving from everyone. I love that this is a collaborative effort. I don't know anything. None of us know everything. So we are using our collective knowledge to make sure that everyone learns. And so after the last episode, I especially had a ton of you talking about Canada's contribution, which was fantastic. And I really appreciate that. And I hope that continues because I'll be honest, today's subject is not one I know nearly as much about as I do about the landings or about Operation Overlord and kind of the logistics and the planning behind it. Today we're talking about La Resistance, which was the French underground, the French resistance movement, which by the time of the Normandy invasion numbered well over 100,000, and by the fall of 1944 numbered close to 500,000. I mean, this was a huge, huge effort by the French people. And you have to remember that for France, this was almost like a civil war because the French government had capitulated and had become a collaboration with the Germans and the Vichy France government. And it actually led to, I don't know if you know this, but for example, when George Patton first saw combat in World War II, his troops, his armored divisions, were fighting against French troops in Africa. So France very much had gone to the Axis at this point, but that doesn't mean that the French people had. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And as always, please add to the conversation in the comment section below. Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll put a link in the description to the original content. Let's check it out.
June 5th, 1944. A group of French farmers huddle around a radio tuned to the London broadcast. If they're caught, they will be thrown in prison, perhaps tortured, perhaps even executed. But they listen anyway. And then they hear it. A single line from a French poem tossed in amongst 100 nonsense phrases disguised as personal messages. A cheer goes up, and the farmers grab their guns. That was their signal. The liberation starts tonight.
So if you've ever seen the movie The Longest Day, and if you haven't, definitely check it out. Well worth your time. If you've ever seen that film, you know that this is a big part of it. They highlight a lot of the French resistance movement's contribution to the landings at Normandy on D-Day. And they show that scene where they are broadcasting over the radio and they're just giving these statements, most of which mean nothing. But if you hear the right one, it does mean something to you. And they hear the one that tells them that the landings are a go, get to work.
This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. 4 years before the Normandy beach landings, the French government signed an armistice that turned all of northern France into a Nazi-occupied zone.
By the way, that armistice was signed in the same train car in which the armistice was signed at the end of World War I. I believe it was in a museum. Hitler insisted that it be signed in that train car, and I think they blew it up afterwards.
They insisted that surrender was the only way to save their people from being crushed by the unstoppable German war machine. But from the first moment that German army boots marched down the streets of Paris, resistance groups began to spring up all over France. The early resistance groups were small, disorganized, and independent. They had enthusiasm, but no direction, other than a burning desire to kick the Germans out of their country. And there were not many of them. Most citizens chose to put their faith in what remained of the French government, which had fled south to the city of Vichy. They claimed to control unoccupied southern France, but really they just did whatever the Germans told them to do.
And that's true, but it's also true that even in the occupied part of France, technically the Vichy government had at least civilian authority in those areas. It's just that it wasn't actually occupied by German troops. German troops only occupied the areas in which they had to worry about defending against invasion. But supposedly, at least in theory, the Vichy government controlled all of France.
The early resistance lashed out by attempting to hurt or even kill German soldiers, but all they really managed to do was provoke vengeance. Hitler ordered the mass execution and deportation of several thousand French Jews and communists in retaliation for strikes made by the early resistance groups. The message was clear: if you hurt our people, we will hurt yours more. The resistance needed to find ways to fight back without inviting retribution and making things worse. And things had gotten pretty bad. By now, the German war machine, which had ground up the French armies in less than 6 weeks, had a desperate need for natural resources and industrial power.
And you have to remember, too, that France had a larger army than Germany. It doesn't mean it was necessarily more powerful, but when World War II broke out and when the Germans finally invaded in 1940, France had the bigger army. They were beaten by better tactics, better training and preparation, and better weapons.
Two things that France had in abundance. They imposed tight rations on their French subjects and began redirecting all the wealth of France to fuel their conquering army. So that became the new resistance target. Take out the factories and the railroads so that the Germans couldn't use them anymore.
And this is important to think about when you're talking about resistance movements, because they had to be smart. They wanted to be effective, but they also wanted to be smart. And as you can see, they evolved from let's just kill any German soldier we can find to let's be strategic, let's be smart, let's undermine what the Germans are doing without necessarily inviting large amounts of retribution. Not that the Germans didn't have retribution for the destruction of infrastructure and factories, but it wasn't quite the same level.
As long as they didn't harm any Germans doing it, the harshest reprisals never came. The British had that same idea. They parachuted agents into France to begin forming resistance networks of their own, recruiting citizens they could trust, and sometimes linking up with existing groups if they could find them. One of those agents would have a radio that could transmit messages back to London, requesting supply drops with weapons and explosives so that the resistance could get to work. But radios powerful enough to transmit across the channel were in pretty short supply. So they turned to Radio London, a public French-language station that had been created specifically to counter German propaganda and organize protests from safely across the English Channel. Radio London began to open and conclude every program with a nonsensical jumble of phrases that it called personal messages, which were actually coded messages for the resistance. The radio operators hiding in France would contact British headquarters with the requested supply drop and give them a random phrase like, "Pierre says hello." Then, instead of resistance members coming back to the safe house for updates every night, they could just listen at home on their radios. If Pierre said hello, they would head to their prearranged drop point. This radio system, the same one that would be used on D-Day to call the Normandy resistance cells to action, was operated by yet another group devoted to the liberation of France, the Free French. Back when the Germans had taken over northern France, a little-known general by the name of Charles de Gaulle escaped across the Channel to England. He had been appointed to government office only 12 days before, but now found himself faced with the prospect of watching his country and the government he was supposed to serve surrender to Germany. De Gaulle would not have it. He got on the British radio and called for all of France to rise up and fight. He invited all the soldiers who had fled from the invading Germans to join him now in London to regroup and take their country back.
So what de Gaulle does is he fills a vacuum in leadership. De Gaulle is not, this isn't the top-ranking person in the French government or even in the French military. But who he is he is the loudest and most vocal leader of fighting back, of standing for free France instead of bowing to the Nazis. And so he rises to leadership. He becomes the figurehead of Free France. And so then naturally, when France is going to be liberated, this is who they're going to look to because he's been the voice of leadership for the past several years. not really easy to get along with for the rest of the Allies. He was very obstinate, very stubborn, very difficult to deal with. You want to see a cool scene that kind of illustrates that. If you ever watch the movie that stars Tom Selleck as Eisenhower, which I highly recommend. It's very well done. A little disconcerting to see Tom Selleck without a mustache, but it works. He does the role pretty well. There's a scene with him explaining to General de Gaulle what the Overlord strategy is, and then de Gaulle's telling him everything that's wrong with it, and they show why Eisenhower had the position that he did, because he was able to kind of very diplomatically deal with that situation in a way that, while not giving in to what de Gaulle was demanding, at least hopefully appeased him.
And he vowed to keep speaking on the radio so that those who couldn't leave France would know that the flame of French resistance still burned bright. Inspiring words, but very few people heard them. Most French people weren't exactly in the habit of listening to British radio broadcasts at this point, but those who did began to spread the word. Of 100,000 French soldiers who had escaped to Britain, 7,000 decided to stay with de Gaulle. It was small, but it was a start. And with that start, de Gaulle vowed to take France back from the Germans and the Vichy government that had surrendered to them. He knew that a small force couldn't accomplish that task on its own. He needed to win support from Great Britain and the United States, and he needed to coordinate the scattered groups of the French resistance. Both would prove very difficult. Winston Churchill recognized de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French Resistance group, but he balked at acknowledging him to be the leader of France itself.
That's true, and also, I don't remember all the details of this, but early in the war, when France was being overrun by the Germans, there was actually an offer from the British to form a united government, to make Britain and France, at least for that time being, a unified nation, a unified government. And of course, they didn't go for that, but I don't really know the details of that. Maybe somebody else can kind of fill in the gaps on that.
After all, de Gaulle had never actually been elected leader of France, and now here he was trying to claim the right to lead a country that he couldn't even set foot in because its official government had sentenced him to death. To make matters worse, de Gaulle had a habit of rubbing President Roosevelt of the United States exactly the wrong way.
Yeah.
But that same arrogance that drove Roosevelt away also proved to be the fire that de Gaulle had promised to keep burning for France. Piece by piece, he built a government in exile, appealing to both generals and bureaucrats to abandon the Vichy government and join his cause instead. Because of his determination to push himself forward as the true leader of France, he forced the Allies to treat France as an ongoing partner in the war effort, and not as a defunct and conquered nation, like so many others under the German thumb. By 1942, 2 years before the landings at Normandy, his efforts had begun to bear fruit. He had appointed a leader to coordinate the French resistance cells on his behalf, and succeeded in forming a central committee that pledged its loyalty to him. British agents began to coordinate their own resistance efforts with de Gaulle's Free French, although they didn't trust him entirely. They did keep a few of their networks secret from him. Nevertheless, they worked together to create a detailed set of plans to support the upcoming Allied invasion.
So you remember we've been talking about just how much was going on behind the scenes, and this is just another layer of that, along with the logistics and the technology improvements that had to be made, and the supplies and the weaponry and the air, sea, and land coordination. You've also got the layer of the resistance movement and coordinating with them, because remember, we're dropping people behind the lines, we are landing at the beaches, we have to be able to, at least on some level, coordinate with these people who are going to be doing these sabotage things behind the scenes. I mean, we were asking them to blow up railroads, we were asking them to take down communications, to take down electricity, anything that could help the Germans communicate, move troops, or be more effective in their response.
They would target crucial railroads, telephone systems, and
just said
electrical installations to sabotage the Germans' ability to mobilize their defenses once the Allies landed. And that once small resistance movement had grown enormously over the 4 years of occupation. Now, over 100,000 combatants stood ready with weapons and explosives that had been parachuted in by drops coordinated through Radio London.
Think about that, because we dropped something like, 18,000 airborne troops behind the lines. This is 100,000. I mean, this is a massive force to have on your side in enemy territory. This is huge, and have them spread out all over the place and already in places that they know, but they're going to know it better than the airborne troops do. They've been observing the Germans for years, and they were willing to take the risks that were necessary.
The Allies and the Free French had pushed back on German control in the wider French Empire, winning massive victories in the French colonies of North Africa, and proving that a properly organized French army could indeed stand up to the German war machine. The Germans responded to that success by reaching for more control of France itself. They ended any pretense of the Vichy government's independence and overran the southern countryside, which only alienated more French people and bolstered recruitment for the resistance. But Germany's greatest gifts to the resistance were the invasion of Russia and the subsequent labor draft in France. When the Germans broke their uneasy truce with Russia, they galvanized the many communist groups in France to take up arms against them. These brand new resistance groups never entirely accepted the leadership of the Free French or the British agents, but they were well organized in their independence and made good use of the supplies those agents gave them. Meanwhile, to compensate for the men they had sent away to fight on the Eastern Front with Russia, Germany began to draft young Frenchmen to serve as forced labor in the cogs of their machine. Many fled the draft by running to the only group in France that would fight for their freedom, the Resistance. So when Resistance members gathered around their radios on June the 5th and finally heard the signal words that meant the liberation was on its way, they celebrated and then they got to work. In the span of a single day, they took down 577 railroads, 30 driving roads, and 32 telecommunications sites. They cut off several panzer divisions from moving north to join the German Defense Force, giving the Allies precious time to establish a beachhead before German reinforcements could arrive. And together with ordinary French citizens, many of whom now flooded to join the resistance in such numbers that the Allies didn't have enough weapons to supply them, they helped guide and support the paratroopers to strike key targets and begin dismantling German control of France. For all of the struggle, all of the setbacks, and yes, even the surrender that France faced, it was as de Gaulle predicted in that fateful radio address that first brought together the forces of the Free French. But has the last word been said? Must hope disappear? Is defeat final? No.
So very cool, and like I said, the resistance movement only grew after the landings at Normandy, and by late fall, I think they had almost 500,000 in the resistance movement. But then when de Gaulle was able to finally land in France and they started to reconstitute the French army, de Gaulle actually asked the resistance movements to disband and actually enlist in the army. And they did so to the point where by the time the Germans surrendered in May of 1945, France had one of the largest armies in the world. I mean, that's how quickly they got their army back up and running. So, we make a lot of jokes about France and how they surrendered, but they did some essential things toward their own liberation and should be commended for that. So let me know your thoughts about all that. Use the comment section below. We'll be back tomorrow with the next part of this series. And as always, thank you for watching. Welcome back, everybody, to the next episode as we work our way through Extra History's series on D-Day. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the German side of things. This one's called the Atlantic Wall, so I'm assuming we're going to be looking at the Germans as they built their defenses and how they went about that. I'm excited to dive into this. My goal with all of these videos is that hopefully I can share something that maybe you didn't know before, and hopefully in the process I learned something that I didn't know before. And with that in mind, the comment section below is perfect for that. If you have things that you can add to what's been said, let us use our collective knowledge to share what we know with other people so we can ask questions, we can learn, we can come away from this knowing a little more than we did before. So I'm excited about this because this is a place that I very much hope to visit. And with your help, we're going to be able to do that hopefully soon as COVID starts to clear up. One of the things at the top of my list is a journey to France and to Western Europe so I can explore some of the sites. A lot of the Atlantic Wall is still there, not in perfect condition, of course, because it was attacked by the Allies. But there are places you can see very clearly what it was that the Germans were building, and you can see just how strong those defenses were. So let's go ahead and dive in to the Atlantic Wall. Don't forget to check out the original content creator. The link's in the description below. Please remember to subscribe to our channel here. You can do that with the subscription button down below. And if you hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications, you will be notified every single time new content goes up or if I post some information that you should be aware of. Let's dive in.
June 6th, 1944 is a day that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has been looking forward to for a long time. His wife's birthday. With bad weather making an invasion impossible and intelligence suggesting that Eisenhower's waiting for more troops, the commander of Normandy's defenses has decided to go home and surprise his wife with a pair of Parisian shoes. In the middle of the night, his phone rings. The invasion's begun. This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. The Nazi leadership had begun preparing for D-Day even before the Allies held their conference at Tehran. Following a British commando raid at Saint-Nazaire and the landings at Dieppe in 1942, Hitler had realized that even if an invasion lay years off, the Allies were already capable of hitting ports in occupied France.
And we should say, too, that they were thinking about the Allied invasion even before Dieppe and Saint-Nazaire. And by the way, I don't think that, maybe both, but I know for sure, I don't think Saint-Nazaire fell until the Germans surrendered. A lot of these really, really strong defensive positions on the Atlantic Wall, we just surrounded them and left them be because there was really no reason to lose men attacking them when really our object was to take Germany and knock them out of the war. But, I mean, as soon as they knew they were going to be conquering France, they were already thinking that at some point this was going to come back on them when they knew they wouldn't invade Britain. When Operation Sea Lion, which was the plan for invading Britain, was called off and they decided that they weren't going to be able to do that, they started immediately thinking about defense. And that was defense all the way along the Atlantic Wall, not just on mainland France, but also all the way up to Norway they had to defend as well, because it could have come from anywhere.
His solution was the Atlantic Wall, a line of coastal defenses that originally clustered around ports but eventually stretched from the Spanish border to Norway. Rather than building a continuous defensive barrier, German engineers drafted 1 million forced laborers from France to create a string of machine gun and artillery positions. These hardpoints had overlapping fields of fire, with artillery intended to fire along the length of the beach rather than out to sea. This allowed the German army to cover a larger amount of territory with fewer men.
And see, this is something that was really smart about that. And if you go there even today, you can see that. You can look at a long beach, and rather than placing, if you just think about this in your mind, rather than placing 4 or 5 guns that could only hit the area directly in front of them, you put the gun facing down the long axis of the beach, and now you can cover that entire length. That way, wherever they land, you're going to be able to hit them. There was a lot of wisdom to how this Atlantic Wall was planned, especially once Rommel was put in charge of it those last couple of years, the last year or so especially. He really did think of just about everything.
A consideration that was crucially important by 1944. In late 1943, Hitler had appointed Rommel as overall commander of forces in northern France. It was a political as well as practical appointment, leveraging Germany's most famous general in order to reassure the troops and the public. Rommel also had a personal relationship with Hitler, which allowed him to operate semi-autonomously outside the chain of command. When Rommel arrived, he was shocked at the state of the Atlantic Wall. Command had stripped troops for the Eastern Front, and many of the men were either new recruits, conscripts from Eastern Europe, or had gone soft garrisoning the wine-soaked towns of France.
And that's important too, because think about it, if you're a conscript from Eastern Europe and your heart's really not necessarily in this war, you're probably not going to put up quite the fight that a hardened German soldier would. And that's important because this is the place where this matters the most. In fact, Rommel, his philosophy on this was that if they didn't stop the Allies at the beach, then Germany was going to lose. He figured the first 24 hours was how the war was going to be decided. That they either needed to throw them back right away or else it was over, because once in his mind anyway, once the Allies got a beachhead and started getting troops across, there was not going to be any stopping them. So it's interesting that the place where he felt the war would be decided, you would have conscripts from Eastern Europe.
Allied bombing had nullified the Luftwaffe. Rommel went to work. He sent veteran units to supplement the poorly trained divisions. He seeded the ground around the defensive emplacements with mines that jumped into the air before exploding.
Bouncing Bettys.
At low tide, he sank a forest of wooden stakes tipped with anti-tank mines that sat just below the waves.
By the time the D-Day invasion happened, I think there was something like 5 or 6 million mines that had been placed along the Atlantic Wall. Think about the logistics of that, and think about the danger of that afterwards and how much cleanup there must have been. I'm not familiar with how they dealt with all of that, but it had to have taken years to deal with all of those mines.
Now, any invader would have to choose between running the gauntlet at high tide or landing at low tide and crossing 300 yards of open beach. He also flooded the low country, erected poles to tear apart gliders, and stationed troops inland to slow the Allied advance in preparation for a counterattack.
And this is what I'm talking about when I said that he really did think of everything. He flooded the low country to deal with paratroopers. So, if there's water everywhere, there's not a lot of good landing spots for you as a paratrooper. The poles to not allow gliders. Remember, we talked about gliders a couple of episodes ago. They don't have engines. They're just going to glide in and basically do a controlled crash landing on the ground. And if you got poles everywhere, it's going to tear you up and destroy your glider before you can make a safe landing. So they really did think of all the possibilities of what could happen. And this is why the counterintelligence and all of that kind of thing that was going on was that much more important, because the Allies were going to need every advantage they could get against this kind of defense.
But planning around that counterattack was a problem. First of all, they didn't know exactly where the Allies would land. Luckily, German intelligence pulled off a coup. They successfully deployed multiple agents in England. Soon, they were receiving reports of armies marshalling to attack Pas-de-Calais, along with diversionary attacks in occupied Norway and... what was the other one? Normandy? Whatever. And aerial reconnaissance confirmed forces massing for these attacks. Of course, every single one of those German agents was actually working for the British. Good work, Garbo. Regardless of where the landings took place, Rommel believed the battle would be decided on the beaches. Should the Allies establish a beachhead, it would be over. In his plan, the divisions defending the coast would slow the enemy down in preparation for a decisive counterattack. As a result, he wanted the Panzer Reserve under his own command, close to the shore in order to sweep the Allies back into the sea. However, Hitler's leadership style started to affect strategy. From his early days in the Nazi Party, Hitler had promoted a kind of social Darwinism among his staff, giving them overlapping responsibilities and intentionally fostering feuds and competition. This meant that subordinates couldn't amass enough power to challenge him, and it elevated his position as the final arbiter of any dispute. In this case, Rommel was opposed by officers, including the elderly Eastern Front veteran von Rundstedt, who wanted the tank reserves held near Paris. This would keep them flexible in case the Allies landed somewhere unexpected, and shield them from shore bombardment.
And this is just another example about how Hitler's leadership style cost the Germans dearly. Another example, of course, is in the invasion of the Soviet Union, when he repeatedly gave orders that went against what the generals on the ground wanted to do in given situations, whether it was when they wanted to attack somewhere, the direction that the armies were going to go, or their desire to withdraw when they knew the situation was impossible to win. You have to wonder how different the war might have gone if Hitler had let the smartest people in his military do their jobs and do them well.
Rommel countered that the long drive toward the coast would make them vulnerable to air attacks. After fierce debate, they put it to the Führer, who, ever indecisive, created an unworkable compromise. He broke up the reserve, giving Rommel 3 panzer divisions and keeping the larger reserve around Paris as a personal unit, which couldn't be moved without his express permission. Only one of Rommel's divisions, the 21st Panzer, was sent to Normandy. So the stage is set for June 5th, and the weather could not be uglier. With conditions so poor for both sailing and flying, senior officers relax in the knowledge that the Allies will not arrive anytime soon. Many take the opportunity to rush home on leave, and that is when paratroopers start to land. At 5:30 a.m. on June 6th, German soldiers peer out of their bunkers to see shapes in the morning mist.
Could you imagine being one of those German soldiers and looking out and seeing, I don't know how much they could have seen from any one given point, but there are literally thousands of ships on the water, plus the bombardment that's happening, plus the paratroopers landing behind you. Must have been not a good feeling.
Ships stretching from horizon to horizon. Then, aircraft engines. A massive Allied bombardment rocks the ground as bombs, naval shells, and rockets pound French soil. But the bombers drop too far inland.
Yeah.
The rockets fall short. Naval guns make little headway against the steel-reinforced bunkers. 1,745 tons of ordnance drop on Omaha Beach without killing a single German.
Wow.
But the roads inland are wrecked. Worse, Allied paratrooper and glider units land between the static units and the reserve, with resistance elements destroying crucial bridges and rail lines, meaning that reinforcements and supplies can't get through. Landing craft begin to plunge toward the shore. On Omaha Beach, the Germans see the first Allied soldiers trudging in the surf. Machine guns open fire. Far away, Allied soldiers lie face down, pinned, as the first wave of mortars and artillery shells fling bodies into the air. Months of preparation mean that German artillery crews have ranged out the beaches and know exactly where to drop their ordnance. The initial slaughter is monumentally one-sided.
So you have to think about that. I mean, all of the things the Allies are doing at this point, the naval bombardment, the air bombardment, it's all missing. It's having little effect. But the Germans, on the other hand, like you said, they've had months to zero in their targets. They've probably done plenty of practice fires. They know exactly how to fire and where and when. So, yeah, it's definitely very one-sided when it comes to the advantage being with the Germans. But those forces that are supposed to be there as reserves, the whole plan that Rommel had could not be effectively maintained because of the issues with the reserves. And that's what it came down to.
One American company at Omaha takes 92% casualties. By 1:30 that afternoon, German observers at Omaha report that small groups of Americans have broken through, but the defense is holding. They're pushing the Allies back into the sea. But Omaha is the exception. Despite fierce resistance, the British have broken through at Sword and Gold, and the Canadians at Juneau. The botched American landing at Utah has reorganized into a chaotic opportunity. Here, the bombardments have had more effect, and the terrain isn't as challenging, but men still die in droves. The chaos on the beach is mirrored at every German headquarters between Normandy and Hitler's vacation home at Berchtesgaden. Generals argue over whether to commit reserves and where. Rommel is rushing toward the battle in a staff car, unable to issue orders. His rival, von Rundstedt, quickly orders the 21st Panzer to meet the British advancing on Caen, and issues orders for the reserve units near Paris to move out. But his orders are countermanded. That unit can only be moved by the Führer's personal order, and Hitler is asleep. Ever since his days as a Bohemian in Vienna, Hitler has always been a late riser.
So think about this. The fate of World War II may have come down, I don't think it did, but it may have come down to the fact that Adolf Hitler was sleeping in that day.
Rigid procedure dictates that the Führer should not be woken unnecessarily, and even in the face of invasion, no one wants to break this protocol.
And this is what happens when you govern by fear. Even when the situation is desperate, that fear still holds. And this is why, at least in my mind, governments that are democracies are always going to do better than a dictatorship. Because when you govern by fear, then that fear is not only a strength, but it's also your greatest weakness. And in this case, that fear was a weakness because everybody was afraid to wake him up and tell him so that they could do what needed to be done.
After all, what if it's only a diversion? When Hitler eventually wakes at noon, he is thrilled the invasion has arrived. This, he says, is his chance to decisively crush the Allies. And yet, he delays. It's 4 p.m. before he orders the Panzer Reserve to move out. By that time, the clouds have cleared, exposing the column to Allied air power. So, instead of advancing, the unit ends up hiding in the woods until dusk. It will take them 2 days and a night to join the battle.
Too late.
As the Allies overwhelm German defenses and march inland, Hitler spends his day ordering V-1 revenge strikes not on Normandy but on London, then holds a conference with minor functionaries. When Goebbels shows him the Normandy landings on a map, Hitler exclaims with delight, "Just where we expected them." Goebbels, who has heard Hitler rant for months about how the Allied target would be Calais, simply nods at the Führer's historical revisionism.
Yeah. And remember, here's the reason why that 2 days it took for the Panzers to get there matters. Because these beachheads, while great, they mean nothing until you can connect them. And that has to happen inland, which is one of the reasons why we dropped the paratroopers. The paratroopers were there not only to cause confusion, but also to secure those bridges and those connection points so that this can all be put into one continuous beachhead. And then we have to go up here and take the ports and all of that. So if you can get those panzer divisions in there and counterattack right away before they can do that, you can destroy the paratroopers. You can prevent the Allies from establishing those beachheads. But that crucial time was lost.
After all, Hitler is somewhat right, in a way. They all knew that a diversionary landing would happen at Normandy. Probably best to keep the strong units in Calais. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Wall is crumbling. Even at Omaha, the defense has degraded. Ammunition is running out. Artillery emplacements fall silent. Americans begin breaking through and enveloping the casements. At Caen, the Germans see one last opportunity, a gap between the Canadian and British lines. A grenadier regiment rushes to exploit it, and by 8 p.m. radios that they're on the beach. With armored support, they can hold. But the Allies have gotten wise. When the 21st Panzer tries to follow, they find themselves running a gauntlet. Fire pours in from both sides. Every minute, another tank explodes. Seeing that the window of opportunity has closed, their commander orders them to halt and dig in around Caen.
And this is because there was just the one Panzer division. Had there been multiples, we couldn't have concentrated our firepower, especially our air power, on that one particular unit.
But the defense is stiffening. All along the battlefront, Allied units begin failing their first-day objectives of advancing and linking up inland. By dusk, the Allies have scattered beachheads, but not much more. Within days, German reinforcements will arrive, and the hedgerows of Normandy will become a killing field that will dwarf the casualties of the landings.
So the hedgerows, let's talk about this for a second. They were basically these tall, thick, like 6 feet, 8 feet tall hedges that were really, really thick. And you could be walking on one side and have an enemy 6 or 7 feet away from you on the other side and not know it. And this is what they're fighting through for miles and miles, not to mention all the flooded fields. And, it's a brutal piece of terrain to have to go over. And he's right. The initial, we set out Operation Overlord was not just the D-Day landings. It was the entire aftermath of that. We set out a series of goals. This is where we need to be by this day and by this time and so on. And we were far behind initially in the first few weeks. But then once we really established things, we broke out and it happened really fast.
D-Day is over, but Operation Overlord could still fail. To win, the Allies are going to have to push just as hard on D-Day +1, and D-Day +2, and every day after that. For all of these forces, American, British Commonwealth, French, German, and Soviet, the fight would continue for 11 murderous months. But the Allies now had a beachhead, and in trying to throw them back, Germany would spend more men, fuel, and equipment that they could ill afford. Allied victory is a long way off, but for the first time, it's in sight.
So once again, really good stuff. I hope you're learning as much as I have about this. I believe there's at least one more episode, maybe two. I don't remember for sure. But, just to give you an example of what was planned versus reality, the 101st Airborne Division, Maxwell Taylor was the general in command. He had told his troops that they could do 3 days and nights of hard fighting, and then they would be relieved. They were on the front lines for the better part of a month. And that shows you how different the situation was on the ground than how it was necessarily planned to go. So we're going to talk a little more about this. I imagine the next episode will deal more about the continuation of Overlord now that they've landed on the beaches. As always, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Let me know. Don't forget to subscribe. Make sure you check out the original content creator. We'll see you again tomorrow with another episode. Thanks for watching.